Hello and welcome to Christian Answers for JWs, for Jehovah's Witnesses. You may have come across my other channel, Truth for JWs, but in this channel I specifically want to address Watchtower teaching using the Bible, the Christian response, and I'll use the New World Translation of the Holy Scriptures. This translation Jehovah's Witnesses publish. So what about the question that really is the bedrock of Jehovah's Witness doctrine? Who really is the faithful and discreet slave? That is so important to Jehovah's Witnesses because they believe that their governing body is that faithful slave. That in 1919 Jesus chose them, he appointed them over the congregation. Is that true? Is that what Jesus meant when he stated those words on the Mount of Olives? Well, let's check that out. Matthew chapter 24, verses 45 to 47, and I think we might get a different understanding on this. Jesus asks who really is the faithful and discreet slave whom his master appointed over his domestics to give them their food at the proper time. He doesn't answer the question. Rather he says, happy is that slave if his master on arriving finds him doing so. Truly I say to you, he will appoint him over all his belongings. So Jesus says that yes, he's going to ask of disciples that they be faithful and discreet, but the judgment of them, the pronouncement from him that they are found faithful and discreet, well, that doesn't happen until his arriving, which the Watchtower has recently admitted takes place in the future. They state it happens at the Great Tribulation. That is is a new teaching. In fact, the Watchtower used to teach that they had been appointed in 1919 over all the belongings and judged back then. But they're now claiming the judgment is future, which then raises the question, how is it that now they can claim that that group of men in the United States that's running the organization, how can they claim that governing body is faithful and discreet? Because the judgment hasn't happened yet. It's in the future. That is indeed a conundrum, and I've not seen a good answer to that yet. But anyway, what about the idea that this is corporate, that this faithful slave is a composite entity made up of a few men? At the moment, there are around about 8 men making up that governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. Is that what Jesus meant? Or was he in fact talking about individuals, individual men and women who are called to be faithful and discreet? Well, what's wonderful about this is that we can add flesh to the bone, so to speak, by looking at the parallel account in Luke chapter 12. And that answers our question for us. If you go to Luke chapter 12 and read from verse 41 to verse 48, Jesus actually shows that there are different slaves who have different outcomes according to how they responded to Jesus' commission. Jesus is saying, be faithful and discreet, but at the judgment we find out that each one of those slaves is judged according to how they undertook the commission. For example, he says, happy if on the master arriving he finds his slave is faithful and discreet, he appoints him over all his belongings. That's one kind of slave. That's a slave that's rewarded. But then he says, if the slave should say in his heart, my master delays coming, and starts to beat his men servants and his maid servants, well, he will punish him with the greatest severity and assign him a part with the unfaithful ones. That's another kind of slave. Then there's the slave in verse 47 who understood the will of his master, but did not get ready or do in line with his will, and he's beaten with many strokes. In verse 48, another kind of slave, the one that did not understand and so did things deserving of strokes, will be beaten with few. In other words, we have more than one individual, but several types of slaves, and each one, according to how they respond to Jesus' commission, is either rewarded or punished. Nowhere is this allowing for a composite group of men or women that constitute an individual corporate slave. Clearly, Jesus is talking about individuals. Now, Paul adds further proof to that in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. In verses 1 and 2, he says, "Let a man so appraise us, as being subordinates of Christ and stewards of sacred secrets of God." Besides, in this case, what is looked for in stewards is for a man to be found faithful. Talking about individual Christians who are stewards, he says, each one is to be found faithful. Notice in verse 5, each one will have his praise come to him from God. And of course that takes place at the judgment. So again, not talking about a corporate body of men that make up this slave class that the Watchtower claims, rather individual disciples who are charged, who are commissioned, be faithful, be discreet, and Jesus will judge you at his arrival. So, who is the faithful and discreet slave? Well, that won't be revealed until the end, when Jesus comes, and we will all render an account before him. And then he will either say, "Well done," or maybe it'll be punishment. But to call oneself faithful and discreet now is premature and presumptuous. In fact, look at Romans chapter 12, verse 16. It says, "Be minded the same way toward others as to yourselves. Do not be minding lofty things, but be led along with lowly things. Do not become discreet in your own eyes." And that is what the Watchtower has done. They already claim to be faithful and discreet before Christ's time of judgment. That is lofty, that is indiscreet and unfaithful. So, hopefully that answers the question. Looking at the chronology of 1919 and where that all stems from is totally unnecessary. The natural reading of the scripture, particularly when you look at Luke 12, is that Christians are charged with this undertaking of being faithful to Christ, being faithful ambassadors for Christ. The question is, will we be found as such? Well, Jesus makes that decision. That judgment happens at the end when he arrives in power and glory. Thanks for watching.